The rancher needed her cooking, but his lonely nights begged for more. Clara had always dreamed of a life that felt alive, full of purpose, and free from the constraints of her small hometown. She had grown up in a place where opportunities were scarce, where most young women were expected to follow a predictable path, marry, settle, and live quietly. Clara had other ideas. Cooking had been her escape, her passion, and the one thing that made her feel capable of creating something beautiful. She spent years perfecting recipes, learning how to transform ordinary ingredients into meals that could make someone pause, smile, and feel cared for. Yet despite her talent, life had not yet handed her the independence she craved. When she heard about the opening at the ranch, she felt a spark of hope. The offer wasn't glamorous. She would be living on a sprawling ranch, cooking for a widowed rancher and his small team of workers. But it promised something she had never truly experienced: freedom. She could live away from the familiar town, set her own routines in the kitchen, and be valued for her skills. The idea of waking up to open fields instead of narrow streets thrilled her. Clara packed her belongings carefully, making sure she brought only what she truly needed. Her small suitcase contained a few dresses, some practical clothes for the ranch, her favorite cooking utensils, and a notebook filled with recipes she had been experimenting with for years. She left behind the familiar faces of her family and friends, promising herself that she was stepping into something new, a chapter of life she had to write for herself. The drive to the ranch was longer than she had imagined. The roads wound through rolling hills and endless fields, and with every mile, the town's noise faded into the distance. She felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. What would the rancher be like? How would she fit into the rhythm of ranch life? Would she be able to handle the loneliness she had heard about from others who had lived in isolated rural areas? When she arrived, the ranch stretched out in front of her, more vast and beautiful than she had imagined. The main house was a large, sturdy building made of stone and wood, showing signs of years of care and work. A wooden fence ran along the property, enclosing fields where cattle grazed peacefully. Beyond the fields, rolling hills melted into the horizon. The air smelled clean and fresh, scented with grass, earth, and a hint of hay. Clara felt a flutter of anticipation. This was the life she had imagined, quiet and simple, yet full of hidden challenges. She was met at the door by Ethan, the rancher. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried an air of quiet authority. His hair was dark with streaks of gray at the temples, and his eyes held a calm intensity that seemed to look right through her. Ethan spoke with measured politeness, welcoming her and giving her a brief tour of the house and the kitchen where she would be working. He had a practical, no-nonsense approach, and every word and gesture showed he was a man used to managing responsibility and hard work. Clara noticed immediately how different he was from the men she had known in her town. He was quiet but not cold, observant without being intrusive. There was a subtle sadness in him, a heaviness that spoke of years of loneliness, of loss, and of carrying the weight of running a ranch almost entirely on his own. Yet there was also kindness beneath the surface, a patience that made her feel that, if she worked diligently, she could find her place here. Her first day in the kitchen was a whirlwind of activity. The ranch hands expected hearty meals, and she quickly learned that cooking on a ranch was different from cooking at home. Ingredients had to be prepared in large quantities, meals had to be nutritious enough to sustain physically demanding work, and timing was everything. Clara felt a rush of adrenaline as she chopped, stirred, and baked, finding rhythm in the work. The kitchen was hot, filled with the scent of bread, roasting meat, and fresh vegetables, but Clara loved every moment. Ethan observed from a distance at first, occasionally checking in to ask about a meal or comment on something he enjoyed. There was no unnecessary chatter, just a quiet acknowledgement of her skill. Clara noticed that he had an exacting eye, not in a critical way, but in a way that made her feel that her work mattered. She felt pride swell within her, realizing that she could contribute something meaningful to this place and to the people who lived and worked here. By the end of her first day, the ranch hands had complimented her cooking, and even Ethan allowed a faint, approving smile. Clara felt a sense of accomplishment mixed with exhaustion. She was physically tired but emotionally energized. She understood that her presence was starting to make a difference, not just in the meals she prepared, but in the warmth and comfort she brought to the household. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Clara explored the ranch grounds. The quiet was almost overwhelming after the constant noise of the town, but it was also peaceful. She walked past grazing cattle, along dusty paths lined with wildflowers, and towards a small pond that reflected the fiery colors of sunset. She realized that life here would test her in ways she had not imagined. The isolation could be intimidating, and the work, though fulfilling, would be relentless. Yet she also sensed that this was a place where she could grow, learn, and find a deep sense of purpose. Ethan, meanwhile, went about his evening chores. He was methodical, moving with practiced efficiency as he checked fences, fed animals, and inspected equipment. When he returned to the house, he found the kitchen filled with the lingering aroma of dinner, the house warmer and brighter than it had been for months. He appreciated the practical impact of Clara's presence, but what struck him more subtly was the life she brought with her. Her energy, her laughter when something small went awry in the kitchen, and the meticulous care she put into each meal were all small reminders that the house was no longer empty. Over the next few days, Clara settled into a routine. Mornings began before sunrise, preparing breakfast for the ranch hands before they headed out to tend to the fields and livestock. Midday brought a slower pace, a chance to experiment with new recipes and ensure the kitchen was in order. Evenings were the most telling, as the ranch house quieted and the vastness of the land outside reminded her, and Ethan, of the solitude that came with this lifestyle. During these quiet evenings, she began to observe Ethan more closely. She noticed the way he would sit silently by the fireplace, staring at the flames as if lost in thought. She saw how he moved through the house with care, maintaining order but never seeking comfort for himself. There was a gentleness beneath his rugged exterior, a hidden layer of vulnerability that spoke volumes. Clara felt a mixture of curiosity and compassion, realizing that this man, who appeared so strong and self-reliant, carried burdens of loneliness and past grief that no one else could see. Ethan, on his part, began to notice Clara beyond her role in the kitchen. He appreciated her efficiency, her creativity, and her calm presence during hectic days. But he also felt a subtle shift within himself. Her laughter, her attention to detail, and the way she seemed to sense what the ranch and its people needed stirred something unfamiliar. He found himself looking forward to her presence, noticing the small ways she brightened the house, and feeling a pang of longing during the quiet nights when she retired to her room. Despite the growing sense of connection, their interactions remained professional. Ethan was careful to maintain boundaries, aware of the complications that could arise between employer and employee. Clara, too, recognized the line she had to tread. She respected Ethan and the responsibilities he carried, understanding that trust and professionalism were the foundation of her place on the ranch. Yet, beneath the surface of polite conversation and practical work, there was a quiet recognition of shared loneliness and mutual respect that hinted at deeper possibilities. One evening, after a particularly long day of work, Clara stayed behind in the kitchen to clean up while Ethan sat in the living room. The house was silent except for the faint clatter of dishes and the occasional creak of the wooden floors. Clara paused to glance out the window at the fading light over the fields. The ranch seemed endless, stretching into the distance, and she felt a profound sense of both awe and solitude. It was in that moment she realized that life on the ranch would test her in ways she had never imagined, challenging her independence, resilience, and emotional depth. Ethan, observing her from a distance, felt an unexpected warmth. He knew he was drawn to her presence, not just because of her skills or her personality, but because she brought life and light into a house that had known too much silence. He understood that this was the beginning of something delicate and significant, a connection that could either remain unspoken or grow into something deeper if handled with care. By the end of her first week, Clara felt she had begun to carve a place for herself in the rhythm of ranch life. She had proven her abilities in the kitchen, earned the respect of the ranch hands, and begun to understand the complexities of the man she worked for. She realized that, while the work was demanding, it offered a kind of fulfillment she had never known before. For Ethan, the presence of Clara was already making the evenings less lonely, the meals more comforting, and the house feel more like a home rather than just a place to sleep. And so, life on the ranch began in earnest. Each day brought its own challenges and small victories. Clara found satisfaction in her work, a sense of independence, and a growing awareness of the subtle emotional currents between her and Ethan. He, in turn, began to confront his own feelings of isolation, acknowledging the warmth and connection that her presence brought into his life. In the quiet moments, when the fields were empty and the house was still, both began to sense that their lives were quietly intertwining, in ways that neither could yet fully understand. The vast fields, the quiet nights, and the unspoken connection between the cook and the rancher set the stage for a story of companionship, subtle longing, and the beginnings of something more profound than either had expected. Clara's first days at the ranch were just the start of a journey that would challenge, comfort, and ultimately transform both their lives, as the shared rhythm of meals, chores, and quiet evenings slowly wove them together. Days on the ranch began to fall into a rhythm that was both demanding and comforting. Clara woke before dawn each morning, the sky just beginning to lighten as she moved quietly through the main house. She had grown used to the stillness of the ranch at this hour, when the only sounds were the distant lowing of cows and the soft rustle of wind across the fields. Her morning started with preparing breakfast for Ethan and the ranch hands, chopping vegetables, frying eggs, and baking bread, all while the aroma of fresh coffee filled the air. The workers would trickle in, one by one, their faces tired but grateful, and she felt a quiet pride in knowing that her cooking gave them energy and comfort before a long day of labor. Ethan often joined them at breakfast, his presence calm and steady. At first, conversation was minimal. Ethan was a man of few words, focusing on the tasks of the day ahead. Clara, too, kept her interactions polite and professional, aware of her position in the household. But over time, they found themselves speaking more, sharing small details of their lives without realizing it. Clara learned about Ethan's daily routines, the challenges of running a ranch almost single-handedly, and the careful way he managed both animals and people. Ethan, in turn, discovered Clara's love for cooking, her ambitions, and the small struggles she had overcome to reach this point in her life. The kitchen became a space of connection. It was more than just a place to prepare meals. It was where laughter started to seep into the quiet walls of the ranch. Clara experimented with new recipes, testing flavors and ingredients, while Ethan occasionally watched from a distance, sometimes offering practical suggestions but mostly observing with quiet appreciation. He began to notice the subtle ways she brought life to the house, the careful arrangement of plates, the thoughtful seasoning of food, the way she remembered each worker's favorite dish. Each small act of care drew him closer in ways he hadn't anticipated. One afternoon, a minor mishap in the kitchen created an unexpected moment of closeness. Clara was attempting to prepare a large batch of stew, balancing multiple pots on the stove, when a pan slipped slightly. Ethan, who had been organizing tools in the adjacent pantry, stepped in instinctively to steady it. Their hands brushed, and both paused, startled by the sudden contact. Clara smiled nervously, and Ethan's eyes held a faint, unspoken recognition of something more than mere practicality. The moment passed, but it lingered in their thoughts, an unspoken acknowledgement that their connection was growing beyond the boundaries of work. Evenings on the ranch were a different kind of challenge. The day's work left both Clara and Ethan tired, but the quiet of the house and the vastness of the land outside created a space for reflection and subtle emotion. Clara found herself lingering in the kitchen, cleaning and preparing for the next day, while Ethan often remained in the living room, reading or reviewing notes about ranch operations. Sometimes they would sit in silence, each aware of the other's presence, sharing the comfort of being together without the need for words. Gradually, Ethan began to open up in small ways. He shared stories of his late wife, the early years of running the ranch, and the difficulties of managing alone. Clara listened without judgment, offering quiet empathy rather than advice, and Ethan found himself appreciating her ability to understand without needing to fill every silence with conversation. There was a gentle rhythm to their interactions, a dance of proximity and distance that neither of them fully understood but both felt deeply. The bond between them extended beyond the kitchen. Clara began helping with small tasks around the ranch when she could, fetching supplies, assisting with minor repairs, or tending to the animals alongside the ranch hands. Ethan noticed her willingness to learn and her careful attention to detail. He began to trust her judgment in ways he had not anticipated, relying on her for more than just meals. Each act of responsibility and care further deepened the sense of connection between them. One late afternoon, a sudden summer storm rolled over the ranch. Dark clouds gathered, and heavy rain began to fall, sending the cattle into a low-lying field for shelter. Clara and Ethan worked side by side, securing gates, bringing in tools, and ensuring the animals were safe. The intensity of the situation forced them to communicate constantly, coordinating movements and sharing observations. In the midst of the storm, they found themselves laughing at minor mishaps, sharing glances that spoke volumes, and moving with an unspoken understanding that had grown over weeks of shared work. After the storm passed, the ranch was quiet again, with only the sound of dripping water and the soft rustle of wet leaves. Clara and Ethan stood side by side, looking out over the fields, both feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. The shared challenge had broken down some of the remaining barriers between them. They were no longer simply employer and employee. They were two people who had relied on each other in a moment of need, discovering trust and companionship in the process. Nights were still the most difficult. As Clara settled into her small room, she would hear the quiet creak of the house, the distant sounds of animals, and the silence that stretched across the fields. She found herself thinking about Ethan, about the subtle ways he had begun to show concern and appreciation, and about the quiet longing that seemed to hang between them. She felt a warmth in her chest that was both exciting and unsettling, unsure how to navigate emotions that were growing stronger with each passing day. Ethan, too, struggled with his feelings. The quiet evenings forced him to confront his own loneliness and the unexpected joy of Clara's presence. He noticed how her laughter lingered in his mind, how her careful attention to meals and chores made the house feel more alive, and how her gentle nature reminded him of the companionship he had longed for but had almost given up on finding. The nights were long, and he often found himself staring at the ceiling, thinking about her, and wondering if it was possible to have both friendship and something more in a world that demanded careful boundaries. Despite the tension, they continued to find subtle ways to connect. Clara began leaving small notes for Ethan with the day's menu or reminders about tasks, and he would respond with quiet acknowledgments or brief comments that showed he noticed and appreciated her thoughtfulness. They began sharing small conversations during meals, talking about favorite foods, childhood memories, and dreams for the future. Each exchange was carefully measured, full of meaning beneath the surface, and built a foundation of trust and understanding that neither wanted to rush. Over time, Clara's presence began to change the atmosphere of the ranch. The house felt warmer, the meals more comforting, and even the ranch hands noticed the difference. Ethan's careful control and quiet authority remained, but there was a softness in his manner when Clara was around, a subtle relaxation that spoke to the influence she had on him. He began to allow himself small gestures of trust, asking her opinion on matters beyond the kitchen, and acknowledging her contributions in ways that went unnoticed by others but deeply mattered to her. The subtle rhythm of their days, the shared work, and the quiet moments in the evenings all contributed to a growing sense of intimacy. It was not the kind of passion-filled romance found in novels or movies, but a slow, deliberate connection that grew from shared respect, understanding, and the human need for companionship. Clara and Ethan were learning each other's rhythms, preferences, and unspoken cues, discovering a bond that was grounded in reality, patience, and emotional honesty. Clara often found herself observing Ethan in quiet moments, noting the small ways he cared for the ranch, the meticulous attention he paid to every task, and the kindness he showed to both animals and people. She began to see the layers of his personality, the balance of strength and vulnerability, and the quiet longing that matched her own in many ways. She realized that her work went beyond cooking. She was becoming a companion, a witness, and a subtle source of comfort in a life that had known too much solitude. Ethan, meanwhile, found himself quietly anticipating Clara's presence each day. Her arrival in the kitchen, her careful preparation of meals, and her gentle voice became points of focus in his otherwise structured life. He noticed small details, the way she adjusted the seasoning, the smile she gave when something went well, the quiet confidence in her movements, and began to feel a connection that went beyond practicality. He was drawn to her energy, her warmth, and the unspoken understanding that she, too, felt the isolation and the need for companionship. By the end of this part of their story, the foundation of their relationship had been firmly established. Through shared meals, daily routines, challenges, and quiet reflection, Clara and Ethan had begun to understand each other in ways that transcended words. The kitchen, once just a place for cooking, had become a space of connection and trust. The ranch, once quiet and lonely, had begun to feel alive and meaningful. And in the subtle glances, small gestures, and shared laughter, both Clara and Ethan were learning that companionship could grow in unexpected ways, slowly transforming their lives and the emptiness of the long nights into something promising and real. Days on the ranch continued with their steady rhythm, but beneath the routine, something deeper was growing between Clara and Ethan. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but it had become impossible for either of them to ignore. They moved through their daily chores with ease, the kitchen and the fields becoming a space of quiet understanding. Clara's confidence had grown as she settled into her role, and Ethan had begun to notice her in ways that went beyond respect for her work. There were small gestures, small glances, and tiny moments of connection that neither of them fully understood yet, but both felt the pull of something more. One morning, after a long night of rain, Ethan had to inspect the fences and fields to ensure nothing had been damaged. Clara offered to help, grabbing boots and a raincoat without hesitation. Working together in the damp, muddy fields created a sense of closeness that could not be replicated in the quiet of the house. They walked side by side, checking fences and corralling cattle, communicating in short, efficient sentences that carried more emotion than the words themselves. Clara noticed how methodical Ethan was, how his attention to detail reflected his care for the land and animals. Ethan, on the other hand, observed Clara's steady determination, the way she didn't hesitate to step into a new task, and the patience she displayed even in uncomfortable conditions. During one particularly tricky part of the morning, a young calf had wandered close to the edge of the property near the creek. Clara pointed it out to Ethan, and together, they gently guided it back to the herd. Their hands brushed more than once, and a quiet tension hung in the air, neither speaking of it, but both feeling its weight. Clara's heart beat faster, and she found herself stealing glances at Ethan, noticing details she hadn't before. The slight furrow of his brow when concentrating, the subtle curve of his smile when he found a solution to a problem, and the strength in his hands that had been built over years of hard labor. Ethan felt a similar awareness, recognizing her care, strength, and quiet confidence, and realizing how much he had begun to rely on her presence. Back at the house, after their work was done, Clara began preparing a late lunch while Ethan checked the supplies in the barn. She hummed softly as she chopped vegetables and stirred a simmering pot, a sound that had begun to feel comforting to both of them. Ethan lingered by the doorway, watching her move with ease and grace, and felt a strange warmth settle in his chest. He caught himself thinking about how different the house felt with her in it, how much lighter and more alive it seemed, and how much he enjoyed simply observing her in her element. Their evenings were still quiet, but the moments they shared in silence were no longer just about exhaustion or routine. There was a growing awareness of each other's presence, a subtle acknowledgement that went unspoken. They would sit across from each other during meals, sharing stories about their pasts or discussing the plans for the ranch, but their eyes often lingered longer than necessary. Clara would notice the way Ethan's gaze softened when he looked at her, and Ethan would notice the small, thoughtful gestures she made, folding napkins neatly, adjusting a plate, or leaving a cup of coffee ready for him. One afternoon, a problem arose that forced them to work even more closely together. A storm had damaged part of the fence near the edge of the property, and some of the cows had wandered off. Ethan knew he could not fix it alone in time before the herd scattered further, so Clara joined him without hesitation. They worked together for hours, lifting heavy posts, hammering rails into place, and guiding the animals back into safety. The physical effort, combined with the urgency of the situation, created a unique intimacy. They relied on each other completely, their communication almost entirely through actions and subtle cues. When Clara held a post steady while Ethan hammered it in place, their hands would meet briefly, and neither pulled away immediately. The closeness was electric, yet unspoken, a tension that neither dared to name but both felt keenly. That night, exhausted from the day's labor, they shared a quiet dinner. The storm had passed, leaving the ranch bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. The house felt warmer and more intimate, a stark contrast to the cold, wet fields outside. Clara noticed that Ethan seemed quieter than usual, reflective in a way that was new to her. She sensed that he, too, was thinking about the moments they had shared, the subtle touches, and the laughter they had exchanged. Neither spoke of it, but the atmosphere between them had shifted. There was a shared understanding that went beyond words, a silent acknowledgement that their connection was growing into something deeper. As the days passed, these moments became more frequent. They discovered small routines that brought them closer. Clara would leave a cup of tea ready for Ethan before he returned from early morning chores, and he would find subtle ways to show his appreciation, like asking her opinion on a new recipe or offering a hand when she carried a heavy pot. There was a rhythm to their interactions that was comforting, a way of being together that required no dramatic gestures or confessions. It was quiet, subtle, and real. Clara also began to notice Ethan's vulnerabilities more clearly. He was a strong, capable man, but there were moments when the weight of running the ranch alone showed in his demeanor. She would see him pause, staring out across the fields, lost in thought, or notice the fatigue etched into his movements after long days. In those moments, her heart ached for him, not out of pity, but from a growing empathy and connection. She wanted to offer comfort, companionship, and understanding, even if she could not fully articulate her feelings. Ethan, in turn, recognized the depth of Clara's care. It was not just her cooking or willingness to help that moved him, but the thoughtfulness and attention she brought to everything she did. He found himself admiring her strength, independence, and quiet kindness. Her presence was becoming a balm to his loneliness, a gentle reminder that connection and warmth could exist even in a life that demanded resilience and hard work. Yet he struggled with the feelings stirring inside him, uncertain how to reconcile desire for companionship with the professional boundaries they had maintained since her arrival. One evening, after particularly long hours, they found themselves sharing a quiet moment outside. The stars had emerged in the clear night sky, and the air was cool and fresh. Clara leaned against the wooden railing of the porch, sipping a cup of tea, while Ethan stood nearby, hands tucked into his pockets. They spoke little, but the silence was comfortable, filled with the unspoken awareness of each other's presence. Clara felt her pulse quicken at the nearness of him, and Ethan felt a warmth that he had not experienced in years. It was a silent acknowledgement of longing, desire, and the growing bond that neither dared to name aloud. The next few days brought more challenges that deepened their connection. A minor injury to one of the ranch hands required both Clara and Ethan to coordinate meals, care for the injured worker, and manage the ongoing tasks of the ranch. They moved through the day with a seamless cooperation, understanding each other's needs without speaking. Each gesture carried weight, a hand placed on a shoulder for balance, a shared glance that conveyed reassurance, or a quiet word of encouragement. These small interactions strengthened their bond and brought them closer emotionally, even as they maintained the outward appearance of professionalism. Clara began to notice her own feelings more clearly. She realized that she thought of Ethan often, anticipating moments when they could work together, laugh together, or share a quiet evening. She understood the growing desire for companionship, the longing for connection that had become intertwined with her daily life. She recognized the unique nature of their relationship, knowing that it was rooted in respect, shared experiences, and emotional understanding rather than sudden infatuation. Ethan, too, grappled with his emotions. He found himself looking forward to Clara's presence, noticing details he had never considered before, and feeling a deep appreciation for the way she brought life to the ranch. He was aware of the boundaries that had been in place since her arrival, but he could no longer ignore the pull of attraction, the comfort of companionship, and the subtle joy that her presence brought. Each evening, as he returned to the quiet house, he thought of her, replaying the day's interactions and longing for the moments they shared. One evening, as Clara prepared dinner, she caught Ethan watching her from across the room. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to shrink to just the two of them. Clara felt a warmth that went beyond the satisfaction of a meal well prepared, and Ethan felt a connection that was impossible to ignore. Neither spoke immediately. The silence itself was heavy with unspoken words, feelings, and a mutual understanding of the growing bond between them. The following days continued in this delicate balance of work, shared experiences, and subtle emotional awareness. Their relationship had evolved into something that neither could fully define but both recognized as meaningful. There was no rush, no dramatic confessions, only the quiet development of trust, respect, and an awareness of mutual longing. Every meal, every shared chore, and every quiet moment became a building block in the foundation of a bond that was slowly, undeniably forming. By the end of this period, it was clear that Clara and Ethan's connection had deepened in ways that would affect every aspect of their lives on the ranch. The work remained demanding, the days long, and the nights quiet, but within this rhythm they had discovered a subtle intimacy, a shared understanding, and the beginnings of emotional closeness that neither could have anticipated when Clara first arrived. The ranch, the kitchen, and the fields had become more than a place of work. They had become a space where two people could quietly, slowly, and meaningfully grow closer, finding comfort and companionship in each other in a life that often demanded solitude and resilience. The days on the ranch had grown longer, yet warmer, not just because of the sun, but because of the bond forming between Clara and Ethan. It was a bond neither of them had expected, yet it had become undeniable. The quiet companionship they had shared over weeks had slowly grown into something more substantial, something tender, something unspoken but profoundly felt. They moved through their routines with ease now, anticipating each other's needs without the need for words, and sharing glances that held a weight far beyond casual courtesy. One early morning, as the first light touched the fields, Clara stepped out to fetch water from the well. The air was crisp, and the dew clung to the grass like tiny crystals. Ethan was already outside, tending to the livestock, his broad shoulders outlined by the rising sun. Seeing him there, so calm and focused, Clara felt a gentle surge of admiration and a strange flutter in her chest. She had come to the ranch thinking it would be a place of work and solitude, but it had become a place where her heart quietly learned to care, where her thoughts returned to the same man, day after day. As the day progressed, the tasks around the ranch kept them busy, but the undercurrent of awareness between them was constant. When Clara carried baskets of vegetables to the barn, Ethan would instinctively shift to make space, their hands brushing lightly. When he handed her a tool, their fingers lingered a fraction longer than necessary. These small gestures, subtle as they were, spoke volumes. Volumes neither felt ready to voice, but both recognized. By midday, the sun was high, casting a golden light across the fields. Clara was preparing lunch in the kitchen, her movements smooth and confident, while Ethan handled errands outside. Clara paused, wiping her hands on her apron, and noticed how easily her mind wandered to him. She thought of the way he had guided her during their work in the fields, the quiet respect he had shown, and the moments when their hands had touched, sending a small but undeniable spark through her. She felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness, realizing that her feelings had grown deeper than she had expected. Ethan, meanwhile, found his thoughts drifting to Clara more often than he cared to admit. He noticed how her presence had transformed his home, filling the spaces with warmth, laughter, and life. He remembered the way she had steadied the young calf during a storm, her calm hands and steady voice reassuring both him and the frightened animal. He thought about her cooking, her thoughtfulness, her quiet determination, and realized that her presence had become more essential than he wanted to admit. His nights, once long and empty, now carried a soft ache of longing, a desire for the quiet companionship she offered, and something even more profound that he was only beginning to recognize. That evening, after the day's work was complete, they found themselves in a moment of unusual calm. The sky was painted with shades of pink and orange, the light spilling across the fields and reflecting off the house windows. Clara had prepared a simple meal, yet the aroma filled the home in a comforting embrace. Ethan sat at the table, a rare smile playing on his lips as he tasted the stew she had made, complimenting her with a sincerity that made her heart lift. There was no need for exaggeration. The gesture itself carried a depth of meaning, a recognition of the bond that had grown between them. After dinner, they stepped outside together, drawn by the quiet beauty of the evening. The stars began to emerge in the deepening sky, their light twinkling faintly over the vast ranch. Clara leaned against the wooden railing of the porch, and Ethan stood beside her. They spoke softly, sharing stories of their childhoods, hopes, and small regrets. For the first time, the conversation felt personal, intimate, not just polite or professional. Clara shared memories of learning to cook with her grandmother, and Ethan spoke of his early days on the ranch with his late wife, the challenges they faced, and the quiet longing he had felt since her passing. There was a pause, a quiet that stretched between them, filled not with awkwardness but with understanding. Clara looked at Ethan, noticing the vulnerability in his eyes, and felt a deep surge of empathy and connection. Ethan, in turn, saw the warmth and intelligence in Clara's gaze, the gentle strength that had carried her through challenges both past and present. Neither spoke of it directly, yet in that silence, both understood that their bond had reached a new depth, that something tender and real had begun to blossom. Over the next few days, small but meaningful moments continued to draw them closer. Ethan would find reasons to linger in the kitchen, not to supervise but to watch Clara work, to offer small assistance, or simply to share her presence. Clara noticed his quiet attention, the subtle ways he expressed care without words, and began to feel a comfort she had not expected. Their relationship had become a dance of proximity and distance, a delicate balance of longing, respect, and growing affection. One afternoon, a minor accident occurred. Clara had cut herself slightly while chopping vegetables, and Ethan immediately came to her side, gently inspecting the wound and cleaning it with careful hands. The tenderness of his attention, the concern in his voice, and the steadiness of his touch sent a rush of warmth through her. She looked up at him, catching the slight softness in his gaze, and felt a bond that went beyond words, a connection that neither could ignore. Ethan, for his part, felt an unfamiliar vulnerability in tending to her. He realized that he cared for her well-being in a way that went beyond appreciation for her work or companionship. Her presence had grown into something essential, something that filled a quiet longing he had carried for years. He became acutely aware of the emotional weight of each interaction, of the subtle joy he felt in her company, and of the deep desire to protect and cherish her. As the season slowly changed, bringing cooler nights and longer shadows, their relationship continued to deepen. They shared quiet walks through the fields, their hands occasionally brushing, their conversations becoming more personal and reflective. Clara discovered more about Ethan's life, the solitude he had endured, and the ways he had learned to find strength in responsibility. Ethan discovered the depth of Clara's character, her independence, and the way she brought life and care into everything she did. One evening, a small celebration followed the successful completion of a difficult harvest task. The ranch hands had worked tirelessly, and Clara had prepared a feast to honor their efforts. As they sat together, eating and laughing, Ethan found himself stealing glances at Clara. She looked radiant, moving gracefully among the workers, her laughter ringing clear. He felt a surge of affection and longing, a realization that he no longer wanted to be just a distant observer of her life, but an active participant. Later that night, the house quieted again, but the feeling between them was different. They lingered in the kitchen, sharing a cup of tea, speaking softly about plans for the next day and laughing at small anecdotes. The familiarity and comfort between them had grown, but so had the awareness of something more intimate. Clara noticed the subtle tension in Ethan's presence, the way his eyes seemed to search hers for understanding, and she felt a thrill mixed with nervousness. Ethan noticed the way she moved, the warmth in her expression, and the gentle patience in her voice, and he understood that what he felt for her was no longer simply appreciation or companionship. It was something deeper, something he could not ignore. In the following days, their bond solidified through shared tasks and quiet moments. They began to anticipate each other's needs, offering help before it was asked, and sharing small gestures of care. A blanket left for warmth, a cup of coffee prepared just the way one liked, a word of encouragement at the right time. Each act built trust, affection, and a sense of intimacy that was both comforting and exhilarating. Eventually, a turning point arrived one cold, clear night. A storm had rolled through unexpectedly, and Ethan had been checking the livestock while Clara prepared a warm meal. When she arrived at the barn to help him bring the animals in, the wind was sharp, and the rain had turned the ground to mud. They worked side by side, guiding the frightened animals, offering hands to steady one another, and exchanging brief words of encouragement. When the work was done, they stood together in the pouring rain for a moment, laughing despite the chill, their clothes soaked and their hearts warmed by the shared effort. It was in that moment that both realized the depth of their connection, the reliance, trust, and unspoken understanding that had grown over weeks. By the time they returned to the house, they were shivering and tired, but their bond had taken on a new clarity. They shared a quiet meal, their hands occasionally brushing across the table, the warmth of the food and the presence of each other more comforting than anything else. Clara felt a sense of belonging she had never known, and Ethan felt a rare peace, a quiet contentment that had been absent from his life for far too long. In the days that followed, there was a gentle shift. Their interactions became more natural, more effortless. They no longer had to measure every glance or gesture. The understanding between them had grown strong enough to allow for comfort and subtle affection. They shared small joys, laughing at a mistake in the kitchen, observing a playful calf in the fields, or simply sitting together in silence, watching the sunset. These moments, though simple, carried profound significance, building a foundation for a relationship rooted in trust, respect, and emotional intimacy. By the end of this period, it was clear that their bond had moved beyond friendship. There was no dramatic declaration, no sudden confession. Instead, it was a quiet, mutual understanding, a recognition of the affection, respect, and longing that had grown steadily between them. They had found companionship in a life that had once been lonely, and in the shared rhythm of work, meals, and quiet evenings, they had discovered a connection that would endure, strong and real, even without words. The ranch, once a place of solitude, had become a home in the truest sense, filled with warmth, care, and the promise of something more. Clara and Ethan's lives had intertwined in subtle, meaningful ways, proving that companionship, trust, and quiet affection could transform even the most isolated of lives. They had discovered that love did not always need grand gestures. Sometimes it grew in the small, everyday moments, in the shared labor and laughter, and in the understanding that two people could find comfort and fulfillment in each other's presence.